series. I am James Okulo, the Director of System Planning here at ESIG. We're a member-based organization committed to providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of the energy transition. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. We also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. ESIG leads one of those 5 pillars, which deals with research agenda for system operators. More information about GPST can be found at globalpst.org. Now, our next in-person workshop will be our Forecasting and Markets Workshop in Salt Lake City. That's June 11th through the 13th. And I sincerely hope that you can join us. More information can be found at our website, esig.energy, under events. Our workshops and webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I really strongly encourage you to follow up with us, and we think that you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find more information on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, or X, I suppose. Now, before we begin, let's go over some logistics. So please note that the participant lines will be muted during the webinar. For questions and answers, we'll be using Slido as we typically do. So please go to slido.com, that is slido.com, and enter ESIG16 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. And in addition, you'll see a thumbs up in Slido, and that helps us to set priority for the questions that we'll be tackling through this webinar. So we reserve 15 minutes at the end of the webinar today for question and answers, and then we'll try and wrap up right at the top of the hour. An email link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also provide short responses to any unanswered questions after the webinar. So getting on today's topic, which is accelerating and scaling up grid-enhancing technologies. There's a growing interest in technologies aimed at improving the utilization and efficiency of the grid. Recently, there's been strong support from the DOE and FERC. In coming years, we know that the US electric grid will face several challenges that will strain our current system and will require significant investment. And this is driven by the replacement of aging infrastructure, increasing power demand, and the shift towards clean and sustainable energy due to climate change. Grid enhancing technologies will be a crucial part in supporting the full and improved utilization of the grid, both now and in the future. Grid enhancing technologies refer to hardware and or software that enhance the capacity, efficiency, reliability, or safety of the existing transmission lines. These technologies can help reduce congestion, improve the integration of renewables, increase capacity, and provide grid services. Now, if you're asking, or perhaps singing, what's the buzz? Tell me what's happening. This webinar is right for you. If you're interested in learning more about these technologies and their potential impact on your organization, you're in the absolutely right place. Thank you for joining us. Now, our colleagues at EPRI will introduce the types of GETs with a focus on dynamic line ratings. A little bit about our speakers. So Erik is a technical executive and program manager at EPRI. He provides technical leadership in electricity market design and operations, renewable energy integration, bulk power system operations, and generation planning. Dr. Ella facilitates collaborative groups of technical experts from ISOs, RTOs, and utilities focused on addressing market operation and market design industry needs. Justin Bell is Principal Technical Leader at EPRI. He conducts research in both theoretical and applied areas and has contributed to over 100 technical reports. His research focuses on increasing transmission capacity and risk management. In addition, Justin works on cross-cutting topics such as inspection and assessment, material science, climatology, and HVDC. Currently, he leads EPRI's research on testing and validation of dynamic line ratings and ambient adjusted ratings. Anna Lafoyiannis is a technical leader at EPRI. Her focus is on strategic decision-making to support long-range resource and transmission planning. Before joining EPRI, she was a supervisor of reliability assurance at Ontario's ISO, where she developed its capacity market and set specifications for long-term contracts. She also held leadership roles at NERC, including a term as the chair of NERC's Reliability Assessment Subcommittee. So once again, Please use Slido to ask your questions. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started here. I'll pass it on to you, Anna.
Thanks, James. And you did a really great job of introducing what GETs are. So I won't get too much into the details of or the high level thing, but so excited to have everybody here. There has been a lot in the news about GETs. And if you're anything like me, and that's not a transmission planner, it might sound like a new phrase, but really it's quite simple. It's any technology, it's an umbrella term for technologies that maximize electricity delivery. I think about it about getting the most efficient ways of moving electrons from one place to another. And if you're really, really old school, you might think, okay, that just sounds like facts, and you wouldn't be wrong. Well, we're talking about things that are new on the horizon and get exciting. And like I said, it's an umbrella term. So there's a whole bunch of different types of technologies that are considered GETs. The way they are defined or categorized is still uncertain. There are people that define it differently, between FERC or other organizations. DOE defines it certain ways. But we're going to focus, and EPRI has been focusing some work on 4 technologies that we see as really, really high potential, that have advanced to the point that they can be scaled and deployed with relative ease. And we think that they have a really strong future ahead of us. So these 4 advanced conductors, they sound almost exactly as the name says. They're new or existing materials that increase the thermal capacity. So you're allowing your conductors to have higher capacity. Dynamic line ratings, which is going to be the focus of today, in part because of the complexity of dynamic line ratings, and also just because there is such strong interest. We really think it's a great example. Dynamic line ratings, also, the definition varies from one person to another, so take with a grain of salt. But we like to call them, ratings that accurately reflect real-time conditions, including wind speed and wind direction, so not just temperature. So they allow the optimal flow of transfer of power. Power flow controllers, or sometimes called advanced power flow controllers, are power electronic-based devices. They actively change the way power flows throughout the system. So they can be they have been used for many years, right? Some people, like I said, you can just call them facts. But the advanced ones, they're a lot simpler. They're modular. They're scalable. So they're very exciting, as well as something to integrate into transmission systems. And finally, another growing area, and this one's probably the least far along of the 3 that I just described, is topology optimization. And this is software based. So rather than talking about your hardware, we're talking about software here. It analyzes the transmission network and it determines switching operations. So you can have a configuration that increases flows and ensures reliability at the same time. So for technologies today, we're going to talk in length about dynamic line ratings, how to get them to scale. I would be amiss to not talk a little bit about EPRI's initiative on GETs, and this is why I talked about those 4 technologies. So we have a new initiative underway called Grid Enhancing Technologies for a Smart Energy Transition, or GET-SET. The reason we're doing this is because even though these technologies have advanced over the last few years, they are only 7% of the investments in transmission systems today. So it's a very, very small amount. So we see it important to bring together our research to share with the world. A lot of this is just about education. Like I said, if you're anything like me, this was just a catchphrase that you might have heard 5 years ago, not really thought anything about. And if you've been watching the news, you know that this has increased dramatically over the last few months. Like I said, if you've been watching the news, right, like this technology is starting to become mainstream. So, here at EPRI, we can be a little nerdy. Here at ESIG, also a little nerdy. We get excited about new technologies. And then the question is like, okay, well, is it hype? Is it becoming real? And we saw, last month, the Department of Energy published a report, a liftoff report. They titled it Innovative Grid Deployment. These 4 technologies that I mentioned were highlighted really strongly as areas of great growth and potential in America, but surely around the world. Leading up to that report, this was in the New York Times. I had to pinch myself when I woke up in the morning and scrolled through the Times in my bed and saw this headline: "The U.S. urgently needs a bigger grid. Here's a fast solution." Talking about grid enhancing technologies. You don't think that your parents are going to be reading the same thing about these technologies as you do. And finally, and I'm going to warn you, don't ask me a ton of questions about it because I am pouring through 1,300 pages in FERC Order 1920, including the directive to consider grid enhancing technologies in your transmission planning process. So this just upped the stakes. So we're talking about not a nascent technology, we're talking about something that is getting incredibly mainstream. But like I said, there's kind of like a range of how advanced these technologies are, what you need to think about when you're deploying them. In some cases, they are really, really far along. So if you look at these check marks or thumbs up, these are kind of these like technical bases that in our assessments and having worked with utilities, we see them quite far along. So advanced conductors, for example, there's 20 years of research. We have done testing, accelerated aging testing. There's deployments of them on the ground. So they're well past like that pilot stage. They're really far along. In other cases, there's more opportunity to do a little bit more work, to think through the integration, to have examples and lessons learned, and more reason for us to all be sharing our learnings. So a few examples here, and actually I'll just focus on dynamic line rating since that's what we're talking about a lot today, right? So there's still some more work on technology evaluation. There's, how do we test? How do we confirm the accuracy? There's work ongoing on dynamic line ratings. There's even more questions when it comes to incentives and markets. So I'm saying these two to queue up some gentlemen that are far more smarter and far more impressive than me, Justin and Erik, who will talk the details about both of those. And I put this slide, but mostly for you guys to have it for reference. I have no desire to go through this in great detail. But from a research perspective, right, as a research institute, we've identified a few things that we think would be really important to accelerate deployment. And again, I'm just going to pick out from dynamic line ratings, conducting full-scale field trials, right, actually fully testing that dynamic line ratings, and using that to define specifications that any utility could pick up, or system operator, to look at this and to evaluate, one technology compared to another, understand where to site, do it well. And so speaking of citing, the third area that has a real potential to help with the deployment is assessments on how do you identify the critical spans, what coverage, right? So, dynamic line ratings is a perfect example. And in the case of all of these technologies, you probably aren't going to enable them on every single transmission line that you own at every location. So being able to identify and value it and understand the cost benefits is really important so that you can deploy effectively. Because there's so much learning, there's so much that's important to do, we're also hosting a workshop along with ESIG next month on the topic is really to bring together utilities, people who are going to deploy grid enhancing technologies, and talk about these last couple of slides in a lot more detail. These are kind of where we think the research direction is, but there's other things that you probably are seeing if you are very deeply involved. If you do want to attend, there's an email address there, getset@epri.com, or reach out to ESIG and let us know. The spaces are pretty limited, So just please contact us at your earliest convenience. So without further ado, let's talk about how we actually enhance the grid with DLR. I'm going to pass it off to Justin. Perfect timing, Justin.
Thanks, Anna. I timed my coffee just perfectly today, so just finishing up my second cup. Okay, so I'm going to take over the slides here and walk us through our information and presentation on dynamic line ratings. Again, if there's questions that pop up, the Slido link is in the chat. So feel free to use that event code and post your questions, and we'll catch those at the end. I think we teed this up fairly well, but I just want to spend a second establishing the baseline, making sure that we're all speaking the same language. So historically, we've had seasonal ratings or static ratings. And what's nice about these from an operations or planning perspective is they're the same every season. My rating yesterday is the same as today, is the same as tomorrow, and a year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, that's the same number that I'm going to use for my rating for my capacity for a given line. Now, as folks in North America are aware, we're shifting to ambient adjusted ratings in response to FERC Order 881. Those are going to go up and down every hour based on changes in air temperature. So on a hot day, your capacity will go down. On a cool day, your capacity will increase. There's other stuff in 881, but that's the key takeaway, is that we're moving in operation space to those ambient adjusted ratings. So my rating yesterday will be different than it is today. It'll be different tomorrow. And my rating a year from now will be completely different from what it is today. So our ratings are going to be changing more often, and they're going to become less predictable. In general, those changes could be upwards of a dozen or more changes per day. For dynamic line ratings, those are ratings that change in response to wind speed and direction changes, as Anna mentioned. So those are going to be even less predictable. They're going to change minute by minute, hour by hour. And the rating yesterday will be even more dramatically different than it is today. And those ratings are likely to change every interval a significant amount. We need to have these ratings to help protect our system. If we have inaccurate ratings or uncertainty in our ratings, we can thermally overload our assets. That can cause damage to our conductors and connectors, or maybe cause splice and connector failures. It can cause lines to overheat and sag further than intended. Of course, that can result in flashovers or outages or wildfires or other negative consequences. So obviously, we want to avoid those things from happening. Now, let's drill down a little bit more into DLR. How does it differ from other ratings? I've tried to just simplify some depictions here. On the right-hand side, you can see a simple static rating. That's just a nice straight line. Our seasonal ratings, right, would be high in the winter and low in the summer. And then you can get down to things like ambient adjusted ratings down here that go up and down a little bit more dramatically, and then of course DLR. So there's a couple of advantages to DLR, right? I mean, that's the main reasons that people want to capitalize on it, and that's it's quicker to deploy than a lot of other technologies. It also can unlock capacity during favorable weather conditions. So if it's a windy day, maybe your wind farms are having some really high generation, that'd be a great day to have more capacity on your system. Well, it just so happens, right, that DLR are going to be higher on windy days. So there's some synergy here that helps us bring in extra renewables. There's the ability to unlock extra capacity. Because the DLR track the real-time conditions, there are going to be periods where the DLR are lower than the ratings we would have traditionally applied, but that's bringing in that accuracy. That's actually, some folks may see that as a detriment, but it's really a benefit in terms of risk management. It's preventing us from having those periods of risk exposure where we're overloading our assets. But we do need to acknowledge the downside of that, where the rating may go down a significant percentage of the time, depending on the practices you have today. A couple of other trade-offs here is that the capacity gains, they are variable with time, right? It's not just a fixed number that goes up and down like a traditional seasonal rating. So you may not always get the capacity exactly when you need it. So compared to a conventional upgrade, you have to have that variability in mind. Okay, so DLR in context of some of our other conventional solutions. It's a very useful tool in our toolbox. That's why we see the interest around this topic. It's why we see the excitement from it in entities like FERC and DOE. But we want to understand how it relates to other things that we have in the toolbox. So ambient adjusted dynamic line ratings, it's certainly quicker to adopt and apply those than to build some new construction, to do a DC conversion, to do a voltage upgrade, but it's not going to give you as much capacity gain as those larger scale projects are, right? So there's a speed element where it can be faster, but the trade-off is it's not going to give you as much capacity gain there. Now, compared to something like reconductoring or retensioning or structure raising, well, now DLR is a little bit more evenly matched against those competitors because it can be slightly faster or in similar pacing to those types of activities. But again, depending on your designs, depending on your system, it then may be the more advantageous thing to deploy. What we need to understand for all of these technologies or approaches that you see on this slide is how do we select the right technology? How do we right size the solution? Which vendors do we select from? And how do we procure those systems? And when we get these technologies, how do we validate it to make sure it performs as intended, both in terms of accuracy and uncertainty and a life cycle performance, so we understand our maintenance needs. So where do we apply it on our system? What are the best places to put it to get the optimal return on our investment? Should we be pairing a DLR with power flow controllers? Should we be only putting DLR next to wind farms? Where on our system should we apply these technologies? How do we do that application? Obviously, integrating it into controls and EMS is a key portion for all of these technologies, maintenance, and then what we need to do from there is scale these into larger and larger deployments across our system until we've hit the diminishing return on value. So there's lots of tools in the toolbox. This is just one, but it can be a very useful tool for certain problems. Now, the good thing, potentially a challenge, but certainly a good thing is right now we are very spoiled for choice in the DLR space. If you were to go back 5, 10, 15 years ago, you could count all of the technology providers on one hand. At this point in time, we've got all these options that you see on the screen as technologies that have been provided. Some of these are no longer available. The majority of these are currently commercially available. And in some boxes, we've grouped a couple things together. So public weather models, commercial weather models, weather networks, there's tens of those. Rather than clutter the slide, we just lump those together. But if you include those as options for pulling in weather data to do DLR, now you've got over 100 options to pick from in terms of what type of information are we going to pull in, how are we going to apply it, right? And how are we going to manage the risks and the integration for each of these options? Don't take the color coding here too literally, because some of the vendors or technology providers use multiple methods to generate DLR, take multiple types of measurements, use measurements and models. But you can just sort of see the general spread here where we've got three groupings of different technologies, some that use fiber optic technology as a sensing solution, whether that's fiber in the wire or OPGW. Some folks using weather models and CFD enhancements and typical weather model data to develop your rating, and some taking physical measurements of the line, whether that's conductor's temperature or line vibration or line sag, and doing something then to translate those physical measurements into a rating. Now, the challenge that we have with this is then right sizing our approach to say, well, we have all of these options. Which one is the best fit for my needs? Do I need the ones with drone installs? Do I want the ones that attach to fiber optic? What's the trade-offs between a weather model-based approach and a hardware-based approach that takes physical measurements? So what we're trying to dive into right now is what is the current state of the science? What do people understand? What do they not understand? What do the knowledge gaps look like in this space? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking through that on the next couple of slides. Yes, there are people who have deployed DLR. They've done pilots. Some people have done implementations internationally. One of the challenges that we have in this space is that there's not a lot of publicly accessible information. This is something that that national labs had posted comments on quite heavily, and a lot of the DOE and FERC comment responses on the various ratings orders and NOPRs is that there is some information available, but not all of it is publicly available. Not all of it has been developed independently. And what I mean here is that in some cases, a utility may do a pilot and the vendor may self-assess. So the utility works with a technology provider, they put up a DLR system, they let it operate for a year, that technology provider gathers some data and tries to explain how well it worked or didn't work. Obviously, they have some skin in that game. So what's very helpful to have is people that don't have a financial stake in that process doing the evaluation. So you get that non-biased perspective, and you can remove that as part of the equation. Also, obviously, when you can make that data publicly available, so not putting things behind NDAs and getting it shared out, that really helps us all understand what's going on in the industry. We've recently been coordinating with utilities to understand who's done evaluations, what information they can share, and what hasn't been done. And you can see in the top right graphic here, it's a small percentage of less than 20% of folks that have done something with DLR have had independent evaluations performed of the technology that they deployed. So that limits how much information that we all have available, right? If nothing, if no research was performed, then no research gaps were addressed. So some of these pilots, are useful for utilities to get experience installing the technology, for going through these processes. There's certainly value in them, but it's not helping us with some of the key questions that we have today. And I just want to maybe call out as a carve out, some folks are using weather stations to deploy their DLR systems. That's a separate approach, which doesn't really require independent validation. If your weather stations are accurate, then you get accurate DLR. If they're not accurate, then you don't get accurate DLR. So that's a little bit of a carve out that we want to acknowledge as a separate entity. One other key learning that we've got as we went through these various other entities doing DLR is understanding how much their average capacity increased, because as I said, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. We want to understand for our long-term planning purposes, for our economic analysis, how much gains can we get? We see lots of publications saying DLR can double your capacity during certain periods. Well, is that a minute out of the year? Is that 100 hours out of the year? Is that half of the year? What does that really look like? The response we got back from folks who had deployed DLR, the most common response was our average capacity did not really change that much. Some folks were seeing a 1 to 15% capacity increase, again, on average. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. And the next was 15 to 30%. It got cut off in the graph here. But that gives us a feel for how much capacity we can gain with DLR. And that helps us, again, know what solutions we can tackle with this technology. If I need to double my capacity, maybe an advanced conductor is a better solution. If I'm in this 1 to 30% capacity need, then maybe DLR is the right tool out of the toolbox for me. Okay, so this is going to look like a lot, but don't take this as a negative. But this is in those reach outs to these utilities that we're working with and field trials that EPRI has been a member of, we've tried to catalog what everyone has listed as issues they've had in the field with equipment, issues they've had with the software deployments, and then obviously challenges or knowledge gaps they've had in how to procure, how to plan around, how to maintain these DLR systems. So this may look like there's a lot of challenges, but the key thing here is that none of these are insurmountable. These are all things that can be addressed in a relatively timely manner with some focused effort from the industry. So things like, hey, we don't understand how accurate some of these technologies are. Well, we can perform validation tests, right? We can close that gap and say, instead of only doing independent evaluations on 20% of pilots, we're going to do it on 50% or 100% of pilots. And we're going to get that accuracy information that we need to close that gap. If we're having issues with calibration or weather seals or other pieces of vendor equipment, then what can we do to coordinate with them to share the information about these failures, get this more publicly available, so people coming to market, people performing updates, they can understand what these challenges are, improve their designs, and then come back to us with those improvements. Some of these things can be addressed with training, some of these can be addressed with hardware, some of them are addressed with software, but the key thing here is these are all things that we have the ability to solve. So as I try to say, it's science, but it's not rocket science. So there's a lot of things here that we can overcome together as an industry with a focused and concerted effort. Maybe just to call out a couple of key things here. In the acquisition space, now that there are so many different technologies, we really need to have some more robust ways to understand the trade-offs of the different approaches, fundamentally, what are they promising that is different? And then how do we validate that? So when we try to target our solution to that right size fit, again, that we know that we got what we asked for. A key thing that I see missing in some studies is a focus on the life cycle costing component of these technologies. Often the pilots are only for a year or two, so we don't get a good picture of the degradation rates and the degradation modes. And that makes it challenging to forecast a 20, 30, 40-year O&M expense. If you're to put up an advanced conductor, yes, you have an initial cost, but then that conductor is up and the cost doesn't go up over time. With something like a DLR technology, there may be ongoing maintenance costs, there may be ongoing licensing fees or data share agreements that you have with technology providers, and we need to get a better feel of how those look over a long term so we can get better cost comparisons and maintenance planning and develop training and planning practices around these types of things. So I just want to maybe close this out by bookending with some of the key points that Anna let us in with, and that's that there are things that we are already doing to try to accelerate the knowledge shared across industry, to accelerate the DLR adoption, and to address the gaps that I showed on the previous slide, right? What's the point of understanding these gaps if we're not going to close them? So we're working with utilities to go out and do those pilots that have independent validations so we can get the data to close those gaps by comparing commercially available technologies against research grade equipment, understanding how they perform, close those gaps, share that information back. Working with a group of utilities to develop those specifications and test requirements. So how are we going to validate that it does what it says it does? What industry standards exist that we can leverage and apply? What standards are similar to what we need that we can modify to make them appropriate tests for things like DLR equipment? What can we do together to understand where on our system our key critical spans are where DLR should be deployed? Different technology providers have different solutions. In our evaluations, we've seen that some have false positives, some have false negatives, some seem pretty spot on. What we need is a consistent method that utilities can deploy to validate the information they get from the technology providers, so you're not undersizing or oversizing your deployments. If you undersize, you could have risks. If you oversize, right, then you've increased your CapEx and O&M spend beyond what you needed. So we want to have a transparent approach that utilities can apply to validate that information for themselves. So I think I'm just about out of time here. I'm going to kick it over to Erik for his portion of the discussion.
All right, thanks, Justin. I'm just going to grab the presenter ball here. All right, well, hello everyone. Excited to be here and talk about this topic. Wanted to start with a quick little disclaimer. Given the topic, I'll say that if I were to provide any opinions on this topic, they are my own, not those of EPRI or any of EPRI's members. I shouldn't be providing any opinions, but sometimes they slip out. Perhaps another disclaimer, really excited to see the turnout for this webcast. Looks like there's almost 350 folks, and kind of pouring through that list, a lot of folks that are listening in, colleagues who focus on this topic, probably more closely than I do. So really look forward to hearing from you all. And my role here is to kind of cover questions and challenges, and not necessarily providing new solutions or get too far into the details. So with that, I'll kind of start off by just, what is the potential here? What's the potential for what GETS can do? So this is showing Grid Strategies has put this report out. I think they've done it a few years in a row. At least the latest one was last summer. I believe there could be a newer one out now, but this is showing just the vast amount of potential savings that can be had with various enhancements to the transmission system. So I know a lot of you know this, but congestion cost really means that there's a limit on the transmission network that requires a more expensive resource to be used that otherwise could have been used if the transmission system was fully available. And that leads to a mismatch in the collected revenue from loads, and then those that are paid out to generators, and that's showing this a gap in sort of efficiency, and in terms of what can happen if you had a copper plate. So you're seeing big numbers here, and I think they've extrapolated some of the ISO numbers that are shown in the state of market reports into a full U.S. Amount, which could be different than that, but we know that it can be large. And this is showing here in 2022 the potential of $20 billion of annual congestion costs. So that's a big number that can be reduced if we had some technologies that can help relieve some of those constraints. So then, what's sort of the opportunities here? What are the ways that we can help reduce some of those numbers? And I'll use a couple examples here, kind of focusing on PJM, just to kind of see it all together in one region. Again, kind of showing some of those congestion numbers here. So the first study, one actually we did at EPRI a number of years ago, looking at the benefits of power flow control technologies. We actually had 4 different advanced power flow control technologies and kind of looked at them, somewhat in a similar way. If you place these somewhat strategically across the PJM network, given some knowledge of where they can feasibly be placed and where the congestion occurs, what types of savings can you see? And we're seeing substantial savings for an annual basis, looking at getting at close to $70 million for just a few additions there. Did see this kind of saturate, and that depends on the year, and that also shows that mobility can be a benefit as well for these types of technologies. But just to get some idea on what some of those benefits can be. Another look is, I think Pablo may be on the line here. He and folks from Brattle have done some great work looking at transmission topology optimization, what some of the potential benefits can be there. This was showing some of those, I think this is showing the weekly potential savings there, with the green showing the production cost savings in different weeks for different seasons, and then the dark showing what the remaining congestion costs, and sort of extrapolating that into a full year. This is based on 2010 conditions, which, as you can see, there's potentially been some increases there since then in total congestion costs, but that's showing $145 million of potential savings from using topology optimization as an economic decision. And then lastly, more recently, a study from RMI that was looking at all of the grid enhancing technologies and kind of comparing that with traditional expansion, looking at what some of the economic benefits are. And as you see on the sort of in the middle there, $7 billion over those 6 years, seeing how that changes as you add more resources to the mix and have greater congestion that they can help solve, but also kind of looking at it from the perspective of what's the investment cost and how does that compare to these potential savings. So a lot of studies out there. In some ways, I think more can be done, but we're seeing some benefits. So I think maybe there's other things that we need to start understanding, which gets to the next question. And I think I saw Julia on the list as well. I hope she doesn't mind my taking a snapshot of a LinkedIn post that she had. But talking about what are some of the big issues around grid enhancing technologies, and there's certainly quite a lot out there, and not to say that there's plenty more we can do from a technology side, from an integration side. But this was actually at the ESIG event, I believe, last fall, and the number one item that those participants who were participating in this shared as their big issue, or sort of what barrier they see, was misaligned financial incentives. So something to think about, something to consider, and maybe there's more work to be done on what does that mean? How do we address that? So timeline, there's a lot missing on here, but just some of the big things. You're really kind of starting with FERC Order 679, which was back in 2005, really kind of setting a lot of what the transmission incentive policy is for today. There was a proposed rulemaking, RM 20-10 on electric transmission incentives, workshop in 2021, talking particularly about GETS, but also more broadly on other types of incentive policies for recovery of transmission technologies. And then, of course, we had, just to mention, Order 881, which did require regions to implement ambient adjusted ratings for operations, and then the notice of inquiry asking various questions on how to potentially move that further into dynamic line ratings and adding features to how you might be calculating those ratings. We had Order 2023 on interconnection reform, which was looking at how GETS could be a part of what solutions there are to interconnecting resources. And then also Anna mentioned, right, hot off the press, Order 1920, which includes a lot of language around how grid enhancing technologies could be included as part of transmission plans. So getting into incentives now. So what do well-designed incentives really get us? And what are the things we need to start thinking about? So I kind of think about it as three different prongs, if you will. First is just investment. So we need to have the incentives so that there's, if something is there that can help save money, improve reliability, is a optimal or a preferred or beneficial solution, there should be incentives for someone to install those, to invest in them. But a lot of the GETS technologies also have an operational component. You can't just install it and say, okay, it's there, we're done and everything's good. We need to be able to operate it in a way that's going to lead to those efficient benefits that maybe we had anticipated in the planning stage. So having the incentives to operate those facilities as well. And then lastly, what I think is also very important is for innovation. So, even talking about, Anna mentioned the 4 technologies we're looking at, there's other GETS that others are including in there, but let's not be prescriptive. Maybe there are GETS that we're not even thinking about yet, that they're in the research phase, early research phase. We want to make sure that there are the right incentives, not for the particular technologies that exist, but for entities to innovate and show that there are new technologies that perhaps can outperform existing technologies. So that innovation part is also very important, and making sure that we're flexible in the types of technologies that can be there. So another way of looking at it in terms of the incentives, I kind of look at these 4 areas. Again, so just kind of repeating before is innovate, kind of looking very long term and just making sure that there is a means for new technologies to enter and compete, and that we're not just saying, okay, here's a technology, let's make an incentive for this technology to come in. Let's be more holistic and say, okay, what is the attribute that we're looking for, and let's incentivize that. And that way, there's a way for other technologies to come in and continue to innovate. Then the investment time frame, of course, as well. If there is a better alternative for investing in that planning time frame, we're building it, we're installing it. Is there incentive for the user to install that? Hedging is another one. So hedging, one of the challenges that maybe I'll touch on is that some of these technologies do cause some volatility in prices and flows, and usually that's for a good reason, because they're providing savings, but that volatility can mean that it's more difficult to hedge for price certainty. So it is an important thing to consider in part of these solutions. And then finally, operate. So again, we have it there, we're hedging for it, but is there really incentives there that we're going to operate in a way that's most efficient? So I did mention the RM 2010 NOPR, which is actually still an open docket from 2020. That proposal was essentially moving the incentives that are based on risks and challenges that really favored high capital projects to one that's more benefits focused, benefits to consumers, and sort of putting that in the goals of the incentives. I'll say that there was a lot of there was some support for that. There was some opposition for that, and again, I'm certainly EPRI is not on any side of that. But other things to think about is, what should this be based on? Sort of the planned benefits that you might be looking at from a planning time frame, or the actual benefits that it has once it's actually installed, and how do you use that correctly? There's also been other proposals on how you might use congestion revenue to help incentivize those investments, sort of allocate some of those congestion rents that come in to those that made the decision to invest in these technologies. And then also there was a proposal through the Watt Coalition and Advanced AEE, and I believe this is something that's already in place in places like the United Kingdom, in Australia, and this shared incentives policy approach, and kind of looking at these different ways to incentivize these technologies in that planning time frame. So getting into the operational time frame, also kind of looking at the different technologies and kind of how they're being operated today, and what are some of the challenges and barriers. DLR, of course, with Order 881, that will be in place in all the regions. There's DLR pilots in many regions, including with PJM and ERCOT and places around the world. One of the things you're kind of looking at, okay, what's the confidence from operators in using these technologies? What's the cost of the technologies? In many cases are quite low. What is the challenges around actually implementing these in the software that we use, including the market models and how that affects computation? And then I mentioned the congestion hedging and revenue adequacy. What are some of the challenges around there? This is an old example down on the bottom, but I think important when you think about, okay, we invest in it, but we can't forget that we have to operate it. And I'm sure this has been updated since I just stole this from old slides where I always made this point in this case from the New York ISO State of Market Report, where they were finding that the day-ahead schedule of the phase angle regulators, which is a form of a power flow controller, was inefficient, with power scheduled in the inefficient direction in 97 to 98% of all the hours in 2014. So it's basically making the flow go from the opposite direction of where you would have the flow go in order to reduce costs. And that had been happening for a number of years. So the lines actually increased the cost by an estimated $14 million in that year. So, okay, we have great devices. They can save a lot of congestion costs, but if you're not using them the right way, then that really does defeat the purpose. So not for sake of time, won't go through the rest of this, but looking at some of the current practice and sort of and of course it's a bit subjective on some of these where they land, and one of the things we want to look at is how to address these if we can, if there are some challenges. And again, EPRI as a research institute, really interested in the research that's going on out there. Lots of good research on how to implement some of these grid enhancing technologies into the operation tools, into the planning tools. Even I think some really interesting work with New York ISO building a what we call participation model for their internal HVDC facility that's about to be implemented, with some similar types of things that could potentially also be used for grid enhancing technologies. Looking at hedging and ways we can sort of address some of the hedging issues that comes with increased uncertainty. Lots of research out there is kind of my main point, but there's still more to be done. And with that, sort of covering what are some of the research gaps that we're thinking of, or we think that the industry should think of, and some of the things that I mentioned. So just the efficient incentive design, so that technologies that provide significant benefit cost value are incentivized, computationally efficient models for these grid enhancing technologies, both in the operation and the planning timeframes, participation models that can help incentivize the use of these resources in operation, of these technologies, mechanisms to better hedge congestion with grid enhancing technologies within these forward auctions, and then finally improving confidence in grid enhancing technologies. How do we improve confidence? Is it through demonstrations, forecast assessments, et cetera, and those types of things. So what's next? What do we want to hear more of? Probably not the get pun. So I think that not quite sure when too much is too much or when it may meet its demise, but we'll see when that happens. But no, what we do want to hear more of is from some experts on incentives and what some potential solutions might be. So we do have a great panel on this topic at the upcoming event that Anna mentioned earlier with the U.S. Department of Energy, Potomac Economics, and Portland General Electric, sharing some different perspectives on some of what they see and some potential solutions that are out there as well. So really looking forward to that. And yeah, with that, I think I'll hand it back to James and to Anna for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erik. And just so you know, the get pun is never going to die. It just gets better and better and better. So we can expect that. So we've had quite a few questions, and we've had a few conversations on GETS here at ESIG. Notably, we had a presentation about a year ago from INL and TELUS on the very topic. And this question keeps coming up, right? Maybe it's rising to the status of the feud between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. If you don't know what that is, ask your kids, right? So there's no debate that, no question that GETS has value in the operational time frame, perhaps even in the medium term, right? As we're thinking about the queue, right? But what about in the planning time frame, right? If you're thinking about DLR, thinking about topology optimization, thinking about switching, and of course, Order 1920 requires that these be used and considered for long-term planning. How do we do that, right? How do you actually study and think about these technologies in long-term planning?
Well, I'll take the first crack at that, or do you want the first go at it?
Yeah, you could go first, Justin, if you do.
Okay. So, I mean, part of this is, I'll say I have not read all of the hundreds of pages in 1920 yet. So there may be some golden nuggets in there. I think the official answer is we'll know when the NOPR 25.5 becomes an order, right? Because with FERC 881, right, we understood what they wanted for long-term as part of that order. For ambient adjusted ratings, they said, use the 4 seasonal ratings. Here's how you get them. Here's how you align them with your AAR. Here's how often to update them. So for DLR, when 25.5, if or when it goes through, that is likely to then answer that question for us. But for folks that want to get ahead of it, the question may not be as much, how do we plan ahead for DLR in the sense of what will the DLR be in the future, because you cannot project it that far into the future with a high degree of accuracy. The question is, how do we want to manage the uncertainty of our DLR predictions? So if we know that it will be between this range and this range, do we want the average for an economic study? For reliability and coordination, maybe we want to come down to a 1 percentile or a 5 percentile number that's much lower risk if the DLR happens to fall below that number. So the key takeaway there is there may be a disconnect between economic planning and reliability studies, but it's really about managing that uncertainty, not exactly where the DLR will be in the future.
Yeah, and all I'll say on that topic is, if you're starting to consider any of these technologies from an operational perspective, obviously you want to think about them from a planning perspective. One of the differences, at least from an economic planning perspective, is there's a lot less uncertainty about what the technologies might be doing from an operational perspective and how that might lead to economic value, so there's potentially just realizing that, but understanding if there's approximations that can be made. But all of these, I'd say that all these technologies, in terms of including them in a planning model, whether that's a production cost model where you're trying to understand what the economic benefits are, or a power flow and dynamic stability model to understand what the potential impacts are from disturbances. They're pretty close to being there, if not there already. So really the tools can help with that, and there's probably a little bit more to sort of validate some of that, but I think it's very useful to have that from the planning perspective.
I'll add just one more thought, and it's not specific to DLR, but if you look at 1920, you look at 896, you look at just the direction of transmission planning, there is an acknowledgement that it is inherently not deterministic, that is probabilistic, that there's a range of scenarios. So, as Justin said, thinking about that uncertainty and your risk tolerance, I think is going to be incredibly important. And that's one of those things that I would be thinking about as I'm looking through, methods for transmission planning and how you incorporate GETS. And probably the same in terms of deliverability studies and resource adequacy as well.
Thank you. And for those who are wondering, it's page 819 in order 1920 that starts this discussion on GETS and alternative transmission technologies. The other question, and I think Erik, you touched on this, but folks would like to know a little more. Do you have any examples of successful regulatory mechanisms to incentivize utility investment in these technologies? And I think incentivize may be a broad term, right? There's incentivizing, there's requiring, there's how do we get utilities to more actively consider and invest in these technologies?
Yeah, I'm going to partially punt on this one and say that I think some of the examples I shared are potential ways, whether that's through different sort of policies that are changing how incentives are provided to things like congestion allocation. I think I have heard there's been some success in other areas around the world with different incentives. I'll also say that there's success here in the United States with some technologies in being utilized in this planning process, such as folks from PPL and PJM using dynamic line ratings and lots of kind of interim sort of examples of things like topology optimization and advanced power flow controllers that are happening with the existing system. So yeah, that's not really an answer to that question. I think it's something that needs more thought, and getting some of the policy and economic experts to continue to think about that, I think is really a big, as you saw from the polls, in the slides that Julia had, is obviously an important thing to continue to think about.
Thanks, Erik. So we have maybe another 18 questions that we're not going to get through. But I'll also ask the audience right now, specifically on that question on incentives and examples, as Erik and his colleagues respond to those questions. If you have examples that you can provide for us, we can then make that available to everyone on the call, examples of successful deployment and incentives. We can certainly include that. We have 2 minutes, so I'll probably start the wrap up now, even though there's some really good juicy questions that we can get to. But I really wanted to thank the three of you for this excellent conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for that really informative presentation. And I hope that everyone has found something that they can take home. This topic is going to get that much more interesting and that much more attention. And so this is helping us really dive into that and get a better understanding. As a reminder, our next workshop is going to be the Forecasting and Markets Workshop in Salt Lake City, July 11th through the 13th. And for further information on all of our webinars and meetings, please just look at our website, www.esig.energy, under events. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Anna. We appreciate you spending some time chatting about this. I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.